Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today's conversation with a very specific, a very visceral feeling.
Okay.
It's a feeling I think a lot of people listening right now have probably experienced, usually at the worst possible times.
Like when you're staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m.
Exactly.
Oh,
Or you're standing at the office coffee machine on Tuesday morning, or you're looking at your banking app, and it's that sinking realization that there is, I don't know, a glitch in the matrix.
the glitch being that the math just isn't mathing.
The math of your life isn't adding up the way you were promised it would.
Right. The deal you signed up for is not the deal you got.
Precisely. It's what I like to call the playground paradox. But it grows up to become, a full-blown midlife crisis.
And what's the paradox?
It's the question, why do the straight-A students, the ones who followed every rule, did every single piece of homework, and collected every degree like they were Pokemon cards?
Oh, I know this one.
Why do they so often end up working for the C students?
It is the ultimate revenge of the back row.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly frustrating for people because it feels like a breach of contract.
A total breach of contract. You signed up for a very specific deal with society. Intelligence plus obedience should equal success.
And that deal seems to be fundamentally broken. So today we're painting a picture of a very specific persona. Let's call them the learner.
Okay, the learner. I like it.
This is someone who did everything right. They are articulate, they are logical, they have the credentials, the degrees are framed on the wall. But when they look at their bank account, they feel completely stagnant. They might be struggling to pay rent, or they just cannot seem to break through that financial glass ceiling.
And at the same time, they're scrolling through social media and they look over at the class clown or the slacker from high school.
The guy who maybe copied their homework or barely scraped by with a C-.
And that guy is now running a surprisingly profitable business, driving a brand new car, and seems to have life on, easy mode.
It feels like a cosmic joke is being played on you.
It really does.
So our mission today is to deconstruct this. We are going to look at the correlation, or really the lack of correlation, between raw intelligence, what we think of as IQ, and actual financial success.
And we are not just going on anecdotes or feelings here. We have a really fascinating stack of sources to help us do this.
We really do.
I mean, we have psychology articles from a platform called B17, and they dive deep into the mechanics of perfectionism and imposter syndrome.
Which are going to be key themes.
Absolutely key. Then we have a transcript from a YouTube analysis that gives this really biting, no-holds-barred take on the A student versus C student mindset.
I loved that one. Then we get into the heavy data.
Yes. We have a massive, and I mean massive, 50-year longitudinal study from New Zealand. It's called the Dunedin Study, which tracks people from the moment they are born all the way into adulthood.
50 years of data. You can't argue with that.
You really can't. And to top it all off, we've got a really heavy-hitting report from the World Bank on human decision-making and behavior.
That World Bank report, I think, is going to be our science anchor. It explains the why behind so much of this.
It really does.
But I want to be really clear to everyone listening. This is not just going to be a hustle culture pep talk. We aren't just going to say, go out and grind or work harder.
No, absolutely not. That's not the point. We are looking at the cognitive wiring. We want to understand the psychological pitfalls of high intelligence. We want to ask the question, is being smart in that traditional school sense actually a financial liability?
The curse of perfectionism.
The curse of perfectionism, the science behind AQ versus what they call EQ, or emotional quotient. The answer seems to lie less in how much you know.
And more in how your brain processes things like risk and social cues, and maybe most importantly, failure.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I want to start at the very beginning with what one of our sources calls the A student trap. This feels like the foundational issue.
It is the foundation. And to understand it, we have to look at the school system itself. And we have to look at it not as a place of pure learning, but maybe more like a factory.
A factory. That's a strong word.
It is, but there's this argument, specifically from that YouTube analysis transcript we're looking at, that the school system isn't really designed to create successful entrepreneurs or financially independent thinkers.
It's designed to create cogs.
Cogs for the machine. It's a harsh assessment, I know, but when you look at the actual mechanics of schooling, the day-to-day process, it kind of holds up.
The source argues that school teaches a very, very specific algorithm.
Yes.
Think about what an A student actually does to get that A. I mean, I can tell you exactly what I did because I was that kid.
Go on.
I read the book. I highlighted the key terms in yellow. I made flashcards. I memorized the material. And then on Friday, I just recited it back on the test.
Exactly. And what happens when you do that correctly, when you follow the instructions perfectly?
You get the reward. You get the grade. You get the gold star sticker. You get the praise from the teacher in front of the class. You get that little dopamine hit of being good.
Right. It is an algorithm of obedience. Input command, execute task, receive validation.
That's it. That's the loop.
The problem is, this creates what the source calls a performer mindset. High achievers become almost addicted to that external validation.
I need it.
They learn that there is a single correct answer to every problem, and their entire job is to find that one answer and present it perfectly to an authority figure.
And if they deviate, if they try to answer the question in a new way, or, God forbid, challenge the premise of the question itself,
they get punished. You get a bad grade. You get a red mark. You get corrected. You get a little bit of shame.
So you learn very quickly, do not deviate. Deviation is bad.
Right. Now, fast forward 20 years, you take that person who has spent their entire developmental life from age 5 to maybe 22 through college, maximizing their ability to follow a rubric.
And you drop them into the chaotic, messy world of business or high-level finance.
And suddenly, there's no teacher. There is no textbook with the answers in the back.
And there is almost never a single correct answer.
Almost never. In the real world, the correct answer is often the one you have to create, not the one you find. The A student is just standing there, waiting for the assignment.
They're waiting for someone to hand them the rubric so they can execute it perfectly and get their A.
But the market doesn't hand out rubrics. The market is just chaos.
That is a terrifying shift for someone who is wired for compliance. It's like going from a perfectly ordered garden to a jungle.
And the source brings up this really poignant, almost tragic example of this. It calls it the teacher paradox.
Yes, the example of the school teacher herself. This really hit me.
It's a powerful image.
So transcript describes this teacher who is pushing her students relentlessly. She's giving them the classic speech. Study hard, listen to me, do your homework, or you'll end up selling socks at the market.
It's the classic threat of poverty used to enforce academic discipline. We've all heard a version of that.
We all have. But then the source says, hold on. Stop and look at the teacher's life. I mean, really look at it.
What's her reality?
Her reality is she wakes up at 5 a.m., she works all day, mostly standing on her feet. Then she has to drag these heavy bags of notebooks home to grade every single night.
She's stressed, she's exhausted, she has basically no free time, and financially.
Well, the source cites a salary of around 20,000 rubles, which, depending on the context and location, implies a very meager subsistence level income.
So she's not wealthy, and the source implies she's not particularly happy either.
No. And yet she is positioned as the authority figure on success for these kids.
Which highlights this massive flaw in the whole system of advice giving, doesn't it?
It's huge. We are taking life strategy advice from people who haven't actually achieved the financial freedom that we desire.
It's a case of the blind leading the blind, at least when it comes to finances. The teacher followed all the rules, she got the degree, she got the good job. She is, by all accounts, the perfect employee.
And she is financially stagnant.
Which just reinforces that robot mentality in the A student. They excel at execution within a predefined framework. They will do exactly what they are told, perfectly.
But the C student...
The C student doesn't really care about the framework. Or rather, they see the framework as just a suggestion, or maybe an obstacle to be bypassed.
So we have this really clear distinction between linear thinking, that's the A student, and lateral thinking.
Yes. The A student is perfectly linear. Step A leads to step B, which leads to step C. No skipping.
And the C student's thinking is just chaotic. They're looking for the loophole. They're looking for the shortcut. They look at step A, see that step B looks boring and hard.
And they try to figure out how to jump straight to step D. In school, we punish that. We call it cheating or laziness, but in the world of business.
Finding the shortcut is called efficiency.
Or innovation, or management. Finding a way to get the result without doing all the grunt work is a highly valued skill.
Right. But before we, start glorifying the C student too much, we really need to understand why the A student gets so stuck.
Yes.
It's not just about their school habits. It goes much deeper into their psychology.
It's wired in.
Which brings us to our next section, what we're calling the psychology of stagnation. And the big villain here, according to that B17 article, is perfectionism.
Perfectionism is so tricky because it's so often worn as a badge of honor.
Oh, it's the classic job interview answer. What's your biggest weakness?
Oh, well, I guess my biggest weakness is that I'm just too much of a perfectionist. They think it means I do things really well or I have incredibly high standards.
I just care too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But our source, the B17 article, defines it very differently. It says perfectionism isn't about having high standards. It's a neurotic need for absolute flawlessness that ultimately leads to paralysis.
It's not about the quality of the work. It's about the safety of the ego.
That is perfectly said. And that's where the key word comes in. Paralysis.
The 100% trap.
Let's break that down because it's a really important concept. Imagine an A student and a C student both have an idea for a project or a new business. Let's say they want to start a small consulting firm.
Yeah.
The A student, wired for perfection, wants everything to be flawless before they launch. They start working. They spend weeks, maybe months, polishing the font on the website.
Oh, I've done this. Debating between Helvetica and Arial for 3 days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They rewrite the business plan 10 times because they found a typo on page 4. They're obsessing over these tiny details because their brain is screaming at them, if it's not 100% perfect, it's a failure.
Because in school, 90% was an A-, and 70% was a C, which was a disaster. It was a red mark on your permanent record.
Precisely. That's the programming. So they just grind away, polishing and polishing, hitting these points of diminishing returns. They're polishing a pebble while the mountain they're supposed to be climbing erodes.
Meanwhile, what's the C student doing?
The C student launches at 70%.
They just put it out there. With flaws.
It's messy. There are definitely typos on the website. The logo is kind of ugly. They probably made it themselves in 5 minutes. It's a Wix site they built in a single afternoon.
The A student is shuddering just hearing this.
They are. But, and this is the most crucial part, the C student is getting feedback. They're making sales. They're talking to actual customers. And they realize, oh, wait, nobody wants my consulting service. What they really want is group coaching. So they pivot.
They adjust on the fly.
They do. By the time the A student is finally ready to launch their perfect product, the C student has already captured the market, iterated their product 3 times based on real-world data, and is maybe even looking to hire a team.
So perfectionism is basically just procrastination in a tuxedo.
That's a great way to put it. It looks fancy, but it's just fear. It's fear of criticism.
And the source explicitly links this to missed opportunities.
It does. It says if you wait for the perfect market condition to start investing, you'll never invest. If you wait until you feel perfectly qualified to ask for that raise or apply for that promotion, you will never ask.
You'll always find one more book to read, one more certificate to get.
The quote from the source is powerful. It's something like, perfectionism is a struggle for success, but it often results in missed opportunities. You're so focused on winning the battle that you lose the war.
And that fear of criticism, that fear of being seen as imperfect, it dovetails right into the next huge psychological block we need to talk about, imposter syndrome.
The silent career killer.
The B17 source goes into this in such painful detail. It's that feeling, that nagging feeling that despite all your degrees, despite your job title, despite all the objective evidence of your success, you are a fraud.
You're just waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, we know you don't belong here. The jig is up. Pack your things.
It's terrifying. And what's so fascinating is how this specifically targets smart, high-achieving people.
It's a vicious cycle. The source calls it an attribution error.
Okay, explain that. How does a smart person attribute their success differently than, say, the C student?
When a C student type succeeds, they often have a very straightforward reaction. They think, yeah, I'm awesome, I crushed that, I deserve this. They have a high internal locus of control. They own their wins.
Right.
But when a person with imposter syndrome succeeds, they attribute it to something external. It was luck. It was timing. Or, and this is the most common one, they think, someone must have made a mistake hiring me.
I tripped them.
Yes, that's the core belief. I tricked them into thinking I'm a senior specialist. The source actually quotes that specific thought pattern. Now just stop and think about the financial implication of that one thought.
If you believe you tricked people into hiring you, what is your strategy going forward?
Your strategy is to hide.
You make yourself as small as possible.
Exactly. Keep your head down. Don't speak up in meetings because you might say something dumb and then everyone will find out you're a fraud.
And you definitely do not ask for more money.
Never. Because if you ask for a raise, that will trigger an audit. They might look at your record more closely and realize you're not as good as they thought. You feel grateful just to be allowed in the room.
So you have these incredibly competent, high IQ people who are systematically under-earning for years or even decades because they are terrified of exposure.
And to compensate for feeling like a fraud, the source says they overwork.
Of course they do.
To prove they aren't frauds, they feel they have to work twice as hard as everyone else. They over-prepare for every single presentation. They're the first one in the office and the last one to leave.
Which links right back to perfectionism.
It's the same engine.
Yeah.
And it leads directly to burnout. So now you have a high IQ individual who is burnt out, underpaid, and terrified of taking any risks. That is a perfect recipe for financial stagnation.
It's tragic, really. It's like having a Ferrari engine, but the parking brake is prominently pulled up tight.
A perfect analogy.
Okay, so let's flip the coin. We've talked about the A student's burdens. Let's talk about the C student's superpowers.
I think we need to start by rebranding the word laziness.
The YouTube transcript makes a really bold claim here. It argues that laziness is actually a primary driver of progress.
It sounds completely counterintuitive, but think about it from a practical standpoint. The C student didn't want to study the hard way. They didn't want to spend hours memorizing the book. That was just too much effort.
So what did they do?
They found a shortcut. They found a more efficient path to the same result, which was passing the class.
And in the business world, we don't call that laziness. We call that optimization. We call it finding leverage. We call it scale.
We call it efficiency. There's an old saying, I think it's from Bill Gates, I will always choose a lazy person to do a difficult job.
Because a lazy person will find an easy way to do it.
That's the one. In engineering, finding the path of least resistance isn't lazy, it's the entire goal.
The source uses a great anecdote about homework to illustrate this point. Yes, the C student isn't doing the homework themselves. They turn to the smart kid, the A student, and say, hey, let me copy that and I'll buy you a bun.
Now, in school, that's cheating. A teacher sees that transaction and gives them both a 0. It's a moral failing.
But the source says to look at the mechanics of that transaction through a business lens. What has the C student actually done?
Well, they've identified a requirement. The homework needs to be completed.
Right.
They've identified a resource, the smart kid, who has already done the work and has the answers.
The subject matter expert.
And they've negotiated a trade, a bun, a form of payment in exchange for the data. They have successfully outsourced the labor.
They paid a contractor to execute the technical work while they handle the resource allocation and strategy.
That's literally Management 101.
It is. It's incredible.
It's early training for management and delegation. The A student insists on doing it all themselves because they need to be in control. They need to ensure it's perfect. The C student is perfectly comfortable with delegation.
And that's where the source makes that great point. In the real world, the C student hires the A student. The C student provides the vision and the bun, which is the salary, and the A student does the perfect, detailed technical work.
There's a key phrase in there. The A student lives in hypercontrol. The C student lives in delegation. That's the whole ballgame.
And there's another superpower here that we need to touch on. Risk tolerance.
Yes, this is a big one.
The transcript mentions some pretty extreme examples. I mean, it talks about kids pulling fire alarms to avoid tests.
Which, just to be very clear, we are not endorsing. Please do not pull fire alarms. That is a felony, not a business strategy.
Right, a very important legal disclaimer. Do not commit crimes to get out of exams. But the point the source is making is not about the act itself. It's about the willingness to engage in high-stakes, unconventional behavior.
Exactly. The C student lives on the edge. They are used to being in trouble. They're used to being sent to the principal's office. They're used to negotiating their way out of detention. The threat of failure is not new to them.
They've built up a tolerance for it. It's like they have calluses on their anxiety.
That's a great way to put it. Whereas the A student is utterly terrified of getting a B+.
For the A student, a bad grade is a full-blown identity crisis. It means they're not the smart one anymore.
So when real business risks come along, launching a new product, cold calling a potential client, pivoting the entire company strategy, the C student is emotionally desensitized to that stress. They think, what's the worst that can happen? The business fails. Okay, I've failed before. I'm still here.
The A student is thinking, what's the worst that can happen? I might look stupid, and that's a fate worse than death.
Precisely. And finally, there's the social element. While the A student was at home studying books,
The C student was out studying people.
teachers, peers, the principal, the janitor, they had to navigate the complex social hierarchy of school to survive without doing all the assigned work. They had to be charming to get out of trouble.
They were building their network.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, business is done between people, not between textbooks. that social intelligence, that street smarts often trumps book smarts in things like negotiation and sales.
Okay, I want to pivot now. We've been talking a lot about these school archetypes, the A student, the C student, and they're really useful narratives. But I want to ground this in some hard cognitive science.
This is where we bring in the World Bank.
Let's bring in the World Bank report, Mind, Society, and Behavior.
This report is a real game changer for this conversation because it completely moves us away from the idea that human beings are rational calculators.
Right. The traditional economic view, and frankly the A student's view of themselves, is that if you just have enough information and enough brain power, you'll make the best, most logical decision.
I will analyze all the data and choose the optimal path.
But the World Bank report just says, no, that's not how human brains actually work.
Not even close. It introduces 3 core models of thinking. The first one is absolutely crucial for this topic. It's called automatic thinking, or what some psychologists call System 1.
This is the idea that most of our decisions, like the vast majority, aren't made through a spreadsheet. They're made instantly, intuitively.
Effortlessly. And this is exactly where the smart person gets tripped up. The source uses this brilliant analogy of an airplane cockpit.
I love this analogy. Walk us through it.
So, back in the early days of aviation, engineers had a problem. Pilots were crashing. The engineers' thought process was very astute. They thought to help pilots fly better, we should give them more information.
Logic suggests that more information equals better decisions.
Right. You're smart, you want data. So they just filled the cockpit with dials, gauges for everything you could possibly measure, oil pressure, wind speed, hydraulic temps, you name it.
And what happened?
The pilots got confused. It was total information overload. They couldn't figure out what to pay attention to. They started making more mistakes. They crashed more often.
The solution made the problem worse.
Exactly. So they redesigned the cockpits to be simpler. Way less information, a much better interface. They hid most of the data until it was critical. A simple red light is better than 10 fluctuating dials.
Okay, so apply this to our learner persona.
The A student is often trying to fly that old, complicated cockpit. When faced with a financial decision, they are trying to process all the variables.
They're looking at inflation rates, PE ratios, geopolitical tension in 3 different countries, interest rate forecasts.
And it leads directly to analysis paralysis. They are so busy trying to read all the dials that they forget to just fly the plane.
Meanwhile, the successful person, who is often the C student type, is using automatic heuristics.
Gut feelings, simplified rules of thumb. Things like buy when there's blood in the streets or sell when the cab driver starts giving you stock tips.
They aren't trying to process every single dial. They're just flying. They're taking action.
There's a fantastic example in the report about a savings experiment in Kenya that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, the metal box. This is one of my favorite studies because it's so incredibly simple and low-tech.
It's beautiful. So researchers wanted to help people in a community save money for health products, and they tried the A student approach first.
They tried to reason with them.
Exactly. They used logical arguments, they ran educational workshops, they explained the long-term benefits of saving, they appealed to pure reason. And what happened?
It didn't work. People understood it intellectually, but they still spent the money on other things.
Right. So what actually worked?
They gave them a simple metal box, had a little padlock on it, and they gave them a key. That was it.
A literal physical box.
And savings rates just skyrocketed.
Why did that work? It seems almost insultingly simple.
It wasn't an IQ problem. It was a behavioral design problem. It leveraged a cognitive bias that the report calls mental accounting.
Explain that.
We categorize money in our heads. Before the box, money was just money. It was fluid. It could be spent on a soda or on medicine. But once the money was physically put in the box, the brain labeled it. It became health money or locked money.
It bypassed the rational brain and created a simple physical constraint.
Exactly. It stopped the impulse purchase at the source. And here is the kicker, and this is so important. The A student often thinks they are too smart for tricks like that.
I don't need a little metal box. I have a spreadsheet. I have willpower. I have discipline.
But the spreadsheet doesn't account for the human impulse you feel at 10 p.m. when you're tired and scrolling on your phone.
Your raw intelligence doesn't protect you from your own cognitive biases. In fact, and you said something earlier that really scared me, you said high intelligence might actually make it worse.
It can, because high intelligence makes you better at rationalizing your own bad decisions.
Give me an example.
Okay, if a C student type buys a fancy car they can't afford, they might just admit, yeah, I know it was dumb, but I just really wanted it.
They own the emotional decision.
Right. If an A student does the exact same thing, they will invent a complex, multi-point economic theory about why buying that specific car was actually a savvy investment to protect against long-term inflation, and it has great resale value.
You're just smarter at lying to yourself.
You are using your CPU to generate better excuses for your emotional decisions.
That is a terrifying thought. And this leads to the second model from the World Bank, social thinking. We are profoundly influenced by social norms and what others around us are doing.
This connects right back to our poor smart person. If your social circle, your mental model of the world, says that rich people are greedy, or talking about money is tacky, or debt is just a normal part of life,
Your high IQ won't fight that.
Right.
You will just find clever ways to confirm that bias so that you fit in with your tribe.
if you hang out with other academics who believe that going into commerce is dirty or selling out, you will subconsciously sabotage your own financial success to stay a member of that tribe in good standing.
You prioritize social belonging over building wealth.
It's a powerful, powerful force. Okay, so we've looked at the school trap, we've looked at the psychology of perfectionism and imposter syndrome, and we've looked at the cognitive science of decision-making.
That's a lot.
It is. But now, I want to look at the hard data. We have the Dunedin study. This thing is a beast of a study.
It really is the gold standard for this kind of longitudinal research. The University of Otago in New Zealand started tracking about 1,000 people from the moment they were born in the early 1970s.
And they didn't just check in once in a while. They tracked them for over 50 years. They interviewed them, they did psychological tests, they talked to their parents, their teachers, their friends.
They have an incredible amount of data on each person's life.
And the findings are, frankly, a bit of a bombshell for the IQ is everything crowd.
They really are. The study found that the single strongest predictor of financial success in adulthood was not IQ.
Not academic grades.
Not academic grades, not even the socioeconomic status of their parents, which is a huge one.
So what was it?
Self-control, and what we now call emotional intelligence, or EQ. And here's the most mind-blowing part of the whole thing.
Go on.
They could see this correlation, this predictive power, as early as age 3.
Age 3. Wait, so you're telling me that a toddler's behavior can predict their credit score when they're 30 years old?
There was a direct, statistically significant correlation. Children who demonstrated low self-control, the kids who couldn't wait their turn, who threw huge tantrums when they didn't get what they wanted, who couldn't manage their frustration.
They grew up to have, and I'm quoting here, adverse financial outcomes by age 30.
And what kind of outcomes are we talking about specifically?
Less savings, more problems with credit card debt, a higher dependency on Social Security or welfare. They were less likely to own a home or have any kind of investment funds.
Wow.
Basically, if you can't control your impulses for a marshmallow as a child, you're going to struggle to control your impulse to buy things from Amazon as an adult.
That is incredible. So why does EQ beat IQ when it comes to money? What are the mechanics of that?
The source breaks it down into a few key attributes. High EQ means you can focus on the positive, you can see opportunity instead of just risk. You have the ability to listen before you decide. You can admit your own mistakes without your ego falling apart. You have empathy for others.
These sound like soft skills, but they have really hard currency implications.
Absolutely. Think about it in a simple employment context. High EQ people communicate better. They're easier to work with. They manage up better. People like them.
That leads to promotions. It leads to better networking opportunities. People want to help them succeed.
Exactly. And then there's the big one we just talked about, impulse control.
This seems to be the core of it.
It is. High EQ is directly related to thinking before acting. And this is a crucial distinction, not in the perfectionist overthinking analysis paralysis way we discussed earlier.
It's about emotional regulation, not just cognitive analysis.
Yes. It's the ability to feel an impulse and not act on it. It's the ability to say, I really want to buy this shiny new car to make myself feel good right now, but I know that saving that money for a future goal is ultimately better for me. It's managing the emotion of want.
So the low EQ person feels the impulse and immediately acts. The high IQ, low EQ person feels the impulse and then rationalizes it.
And a high EQ person feels the impulse, acknowledges it, and then regulates it. They can sit with the discomfort of not buying the thing.
Which is a financial superpower.
It's everything.
Yeah.
Now, for everyone listening who is thinking, well, I was definitely a bratty 3-year-old, so am I just Doomed? Is it too late for me?
That's a good question.
The source has good news. It emphasizes that EQ and self-control are not fixed at birth. They are trainable skills.
It's nurture, not just nature.
Exactly. The study highlights that parents and teachers can actively train this in children. It mentions simple techniques like naming and validating feelings can help a child develop this entire skill set.
And as adults, we can still learn it too.
We can. It's never too late to learn self-regulation. You can build that mental box for yourself, so to speak.
That's a huge relief. Okay, so we have all these pieces on the table now. Let's try to synthesize this. Let's really nail down the answer. Why do smart people stay poor?
I think we can boil it down to a few deadly intersections of these ideas. First, and this is a big one, is the fear of sales.
This was from that Smart and Poor B17 article.
It was. Smart people, particularly those from academic backgrounds, often view sales as begging or imposing or something dirty.
They have this core belief that if the product is good enough, if it's perfect, it will sell itself.
Which is probably the single biggest lie in the entire world of business.
Nothing sells itself, ever. But the C student, they don't have that hang-up. They have less of their ego and pride tied up in the idea of perfection. They are, for lack of a better word, shameless in a good way.
They are willing to ask for the sale. They are willing to hear the word no 100 times.
And the A student takes no as a personal rejection of their intelligence and their work. The C student just takes no as a data point. Okay, that person doesn't want it. Next.
That's a huge difference.
Massive. Then you have the overthinking trap. The source implies a reference to that old idea of woe from wit, the notion that your intellect actually causes you sorrow.
Because smart people are really, really good at simulating the future.
They can visualize every single possible failure scenario in glorious high-definition 4K. What if the market crashes? What if I get sued? What if I launch this and people laugh at me?
And because that mental simulation feels so real, their nervous system reacts as if it has already happened.
They feel the shame and the pain of the bankruptcy before they've even registered the business name.
And so they never take the first step.
Which connects the World Bank's automatic thinking with the C student's laziness. Sometimes the quick, good enough decision is economically superior to the perfect, but delayed decision.
The cost of delay is often much higher than the cost of making a mistake.
That's a brilliant way to put it. The C student pays the cost of mistakes, they pay tuition to the School of Hard Knocks, and they learn. The A student pays the cost of inaction, and over a lifetime, inaction is much, much more expensive.
Wow. Okay, this has been a journey. We've gone from the classroom to a 1950s airplane cockpit to a 50-year study in New Zealand. Let's bring it all home for everyone.
Let's do a recap. So to start, the school system rewards a very specific type of compliance and linear execution. This creates a cog mindset that just doesn't map well to the chaotic free market.
And if you were good at that system, you likely picked up some psychological baggage along the way. Perfectionism and imposter syndrome. You learned to fear mistakes and to crave external validation.
Meanwhile, the C students, or maybe a better term is the lateral thinkers, they were developing a different set of skills that the school system didn't value, but the market absolutely loves.
Things like delegation, a high tolerance for risk, and social intelligence.
And the hard data confirms this. Real-world success, backed by that huge Dunedin study, comes more from emotional intelligence, self-regulation, impulse control, and social skills, not from raw cognitive processing power.
So what is the actionable takeaway here? We aren't telling people to go get a lobotomy. We want you to stay smart.
Of course. But we want the A students listening to maybe try and cultivate a little bit of that C student energy.
Practice what you called constructive laziness.
I love that term, yes.
What does that look like in practice, day to day?
It means delegating something this week. Stop trying to do everything yourself just to ensure it's perfect. Find someone who can do it 80% as well as you can and let them do it. Let go of that hyper-control.
And stop waiting for the grade.
Stop waiting for the grade. There is no teacher coming to check your work. Launch the project. Ask for the raise. Send the email. Do it before you feel 100% ready.
Launch at 80%.
Launch at 70%. You can fix it later. The market rewards speed and iteration, not perfect first drafts that arrive too late.
That gives me a little bit of anxiety just hearing you say it, which probably means I need to do it.
That's how you know it's working. It's the only way to break the paralysis.
All right, so here is a provocative final thought for everyone listening. I want you to look at that project you've been sitting on, that business idea, or that difficult conversation you've been avoiding.
And ask yourself this question honestly. If you are waiting for the perfect moment to start, are you being smart Or are you just scared?
And then ask yourself a second question. If a C student were in your shoes, someone who didn't know enough to be afraid, someone who wasn't worried about looking stupid, would they have already done it yesterday?
Probably. And they'd be cashing the check by now.
Ouch. But fair. That's all for this deep dive. Go out there, embrace a little bit of the chaos, and maybe, just maybe, lower your standards a little bit.
Just a little bit, in a productive way.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.